Hey everybody, and welcome to week 5 of church history, looking at the history of Christianity from 33 to about 1500 AD. This week we are looking at how persecution sort of intensifies for Christians in the Roman Empire, and we are primarily looking at persecution in the 2nd through 4th centuries. But there are a couple things that we want to look at before we sort of get into the details about that. I know last week I planned on talking about what happened to some of the apostles and the leading figures of the church, but I decided to move that to this week because in a way it will sort of tie in with what we are talking about when it comes to further persecution of Christianity beyond the first century. All right, so there are a few things that we want to do. Again, first we want to talk about the fates of leading church figures. And I changed this from the apostles because we're not looking at all the apostles, and we're actually going to look at one specific biblical individual who is not an apostle but yet had a prominent impact on some things in church history that we'll look at in this class period. And I will say that this will not be sort of as neatly spread out among the three major points that we're looking at. So this first point that we'll talk about, the fate of the leading church figures, probably won't take too long. So we'll go ahead and get into the second point later on in this video. All right, so again, we want to talk about the origins of 5 important churches, which we'll mention those churches in a moment. But these 5 churches are going to become probably the most prominent and probably the congregations that had the most influence among Christianity in the 3rd, 4th, and the next couple of centuries after that. And we're going to note that the origins of these churches, at least according to tradition, stretch back to some of the apostles and to a couple of prominent members of the church in the 1st century. Within this, too, we want to talk about how Christianity spreads outside the Roman Empire, because really everything that we've talked about in terms of the locations everything has taken place within the confines of the Roman Empire, but Christianity was not limited to the empire. It did spread elsewhere and outside the empire within the first few centuries of the church. Then we want to talk about, in sort of the second major point, talking about renewed persecution, and we'll divide that into 2 different stages. One, we'll look at some of the important moments in the 2nd and 3rd century connected with certain Roman emperors who were attributed as starting new, what we might say are waves of persecution. And then at the end, we'll talk about the final wave of persecution, and maybe the most maybe the most well-known, maybe the most harsh, that comes at the beginning of the 4th century. And then in the last place, we'll talk about the rationale for why this persecution was beginning to take place and why it sort of changed in a way. And on top of that, we'll talk about some of the rumors that were attributed to Christians, because this is also another factor that led to persecution. So let's talk about, first of all, the fates of some of the important leading church figures. And I'll get my notes pulled back up. All right, so just to begin with, as a way of an introduction, we know that the Bible does not record a lot about the death of the apostles. Now that is, in spite of a couple of things. One, we know that James, the brother of John, is mentioned as dying at the hand of Herod in Acts chapter 12. And when you look at the New Testament, Peter's, what we might say his end or his death, is possibly referenced in John chapter 21. Paul's death is possibly also referenced in the book of Acts, based on the prophecy that Agabus gave about Paul. And that comes in chapters 21 or 22. I didn't mark that down. So you do have You do have a direct mention of James, the apostle, his death, and you've got some allusions to Peter and Paul's death, possibly in the New Testament. Despite the fact that you don't have a lot of evidence in the Bible, there are a lot of traditions that are connected to the apostles that are passed down over time, that were written in different various works. And these traditions again, are not Scripture. Sometimes their accounts are pretty, you can probably guarantee that they're pretty untrustworthy just due to a couple of things. And historians have noted that sometimes this can complicate trying to talk about how Christianity spread because you've got different churches that are trying to state that a certain apostle founded them. And as we'll talk about more, we've mentioned this before, but churches were trying to do this to gain more credibility in fighting against heresies like Marcianism and Gnosticism. And so that was one reason why some of these churches are claiming that a certain apostle founded them, to give them more credibility. And even though it can complicate some things, we do want to look at it. There are really two main reasons that I want you to note about why we're going to study these traditions, at least a few of them. And the two main reasons are, first of all, that these traditions do show that Christianity was spreading beyond the book of Acts. Of course, when you think about the book of Acts, if you haven't had that class, the end goal there in the book is how the gospel got to Rome. And Rome's certainly an important city, but it's not the only city that existed in the world at the time. Even though it's important, there are other cities where the gospel needed to go. And if we only look at the book of Acts, we might think that all the efforts of the apostles were trying to get the gospel to Rome, when in reality, there were Christians that were taking the gospel to a lot of other places that the book of Acts does not record. And so, whereas if we look at the book of Acts, we might think that it's only, Peter and John early on, Peter later on, and then Paul by the end of the book, we may think that it's only those individuals that are going out preaching the gospel based on that book. But in reality, the apostles are going to different places. It's just that the book of Acts doesn't record what those apostles were doing. And really why this becomes important is not so much that these traditions are true, that these apostles 100% sure went to these locations. More so it reveals that by the end of the 5th century, so the end of the 400s, we do have a somewhat accurate idea of how far Christianity had expanded throughout the world. And even though some of these apostles, some of these leaders may never have reached these areas, we can know for sure by 400 AD the fact that Christians are writing about the gospel going to these areas, it shows that the gospel actually reached those areas. Despite the fact that those apostles and leading men may not have reached there, we do know that Christianity existed within those places by the 400s AD. And this will, again, showing that Christianity is spreading throughout such a vast territory, this is also going to tie in with why Christianity becomes persecuted a little bit more than what we've talked about. The intensity, the extent of it is going to increase. And of course, as we sort of mentioned already, another important reason to study the traditions of these apostles is that you begin to see how certain congregations become more important or more prominent than others. Again, if you can claim that your congregation was started by an apostle due to what we've talked about with apostolic succession and how the office of an apostle transferred to the bishop of that congregation, and it kept on going down the line as a new bishop would be appointed after the old one died, it gave more importance to certain congregations. And the 5 most important that we want to note, there we go. I've got that slide twice for some reason. So there at the end, here we go. Right, so five congregations rise to the top out of all of these. And these are the 5 that you want to know. They're the congregation in Rome, the congregation in Constantinople, the congregation in Alexandria, the congregation in Antioch, and the congregation in Jerusalem. These are the 5 most important churches, the 5 most important cities that you want to keep in mind. And having noted these 5, let's talk about the origins of each of these 5 churches. And I'll go ahead and say that we've already talked about the origin of the church in Jerusalem because it's mentioned for us in the book of Acts. So we already have that down. And so let's begin by talking about the Apostle Andrew. And again, what we're talking about here are the traditions that are assigned to these men. So what we take here, take it with a grain of salt. So let's talk about his work according to tradition. So Andrew was supposedly sent to a region called Scythia, or Scythia, however you want to pronounce that. And I don't have this down, but there is one of the traditions states that the apostles determined which areas they were going to by casting lots. Again, we don't have any biblical evidence of that, but that's what tradition says. And I believe that tradition also comes from Eusebius, who was the one that reported that Andrew went to Scythia. And I don't have the way that I figured out doing this, the best way to do this, I guess, because I want to pull up some maps, because if you're looking there at Scythia, you may not know where that's at, because there's not a place called Scythia today. And so what I want to do is to pull up a map. And this is coming from the University of Texas website mainly, and I'll put the link to it in Canvas. But here is a map of the Roman Empire in the 1st century, and I want to go ahead and move. There you go. That way that's at the bottom. All right, so if you're thinking about where Scythia is, Scythia is this region right here where my mouse is at. So you see the Bosporai Regnum, which is just sort of a territory within the Roman Empire. And it's its own kingdom, but it's sort of under the influence of the Roman Empire. But this circular area, sort of southern Scythia, Scythia would encompass all of this area up here, which, if you look on a modern map, you're talking about what is today Ukraine, what is today southern Russia, and even farther to the east. So this area right over here, which is the country of Georgia, not the state, but the country of Georgia. So you're talking about you're talking about on up east. So where we talking about Jerusalem there? When I say Andrew's going to Scythia, he's going all the way up here. So again, that may be small to look at, but you're talking about this area, which is where he was reportedly went. So pulling that back up again. This meant that, for Andrew, the Apostle Andrew, the Orthodox churches in Romania, Russia, and Georgia, and Ukraine, I didn't have that there, but primarily Romania, Russia, and Georgia, they all hold the Apostle Andrew in high regard because it was reported that Andrew went to these places and took the gospel to them. Well, he not only went there, but he was also the supposed founder of the church in Constantinople. And I will pull up a map of that in a moment. The region that one writer said that he preached in, he not only preached in Scythia, according to tradition, he also preached in Thrace, which is northeast of Greece. And this is when he would establish the congregation in Constantinople. And so the Church of Constantinople becomes important because it was supposedly created by Andrew. And later on, after the 4th and 5th century, Constantinople will begin to become the main rival to the church in Rome. I do want to mention this about Andrew's death. I think this might be a little interesting. It was supposed he supposedly died on a cross, but it was in the shape of an X. And this X became known as St. Andrew's Cross. So if you see a modern day flag of Scotland, so if you see this is the flag of Scotland, that white X, you might have heard of something called St. Andrew's Cross. That's what's on the flag there in Scotland. And that goes back to, again, another tradition that some of the personal belongings of Andrew were taken to Scotland. And so that's where the St. Andrew's cross comes from on the flag of Scotland. You may have heard that before, but I thought that was interesting to point out. I want to go back and try to find a picture of, so this is, all right, so this is Thrace right here. All right, this is the region of Thrace. There's a city here, it's called Byzantium. That's also the same city as Constantinople. It just goes by a different name. So when you're talking about the church that Andrew supposedly founded, you're talking about this congregation, this church being located right here. This is the Black Sea. This is the Mediterranean Sea. So you're talking about that congregation right there. So thinking about the city of Constantinople, maybe that gives you an idea of where it's at. Right there where, of course, this is Turkey in modern day. And Constantinople actually today is called Istanbul, and it's the actual capital of Turkey today. So maybe that gives you an idea of where the city is located. All right, so that is Constantinople. So Constantinople is connected with Andrew, and that's probably how I'll do this, connecting the supposed apostle or leading figure with the church that was attributed to them by tradition. All right, so Peter, right, according to tradition, one of the things that's said about him is that he supposedly found and established the church in Antioch of Syria, which is, again, one of the 5 important churches. This all comes after the events of the first few chapters in the book of Acts, where Peter is primarily in Jerusalem and Palestine. And the first place that he goes to outside those regions is Antioch of Syria and establishes a congregation there. He supposedly becomes a bishop there, and his importance is there. Antioch is obviously, we talked about with Ignatius. You know, Ignatius believed in apostolic succession, and so he felt that his authority maybe traced back to Peter being a bishop there. After Peter was through in Antioch, he supposedly went to Corinth, which Paul does reference Peter in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, so it might have been the case that he did go to Corinth. But what people most often associate Peter with when it comes to tradition is his travels to Rome. It's supposed that he lived there and died at the hand of Nero, but there really isn't any physical evidence of this. Really, writers are the ones that have said that. There are numerous writers that said that Peter lived and died in Rome, but all you really have are the words of the writers. You don't have any physical evidence per se that demonstrates that. In reality, the church in Rome was probably founded by average Christians. If you keep in mind Romans chapter 1, verse 13, Paul is writing to the church in Rome, and Paul clearly states there that he had never been to Rome. He had never met with those Christians before. And in the introduction and the end of Romans 1 and Romans 16, you don't see Peter's name mentioned anywhere. So, you know, if Peter was already living there by the time Paul is writing to them, would have made sense for Paul to reference Peter, but he does not. But it does go to show that, you know, when it comes to the founding of congregations, that a lot of times this was being done by average members. It didn't take somebody who was an apostle or somebody who was sort of seen as a prominent figure to teach others and to help create congregations. This was being done by average Christians. Nevertheless, despite the lack of physical evidence, you do have people that try to connect Peter to Rome. And so, right, part of Rome's importance comes from, Peter being connected and Peter supposedly being the first bishop of the church in Rome, despite the lack of evidence that we have for it. All right, so let's talk about Paul. And according to tradition, at the end of the book of Romans, Paul does mention about going to Spain. And there is a tradition that Paul does make a trip to Spain after his first imprisonment, which is the imprisonment that comes to Paul at the end of the book of Acts. So at the end of the book of Acts, Paul's in prison. After he's released from prison, it's thought that he went to Spain and then came back and possibly began a 4th missionary journey. And then at some point he became imprisoned in Rome a second time, where the second letter to Timothy was written. And so Paul has a strong connection to the church in Rome because he was there. And so, right, with the church in Rome, not only do you have Peter connected to it, but you also have the Apostle Paul. Paul was considered to be a leading figure there in the church at Rome. And so, again, that helps shows why Rome became an important congregation. And then the final individual we want to talk about is Mark. Right? And Mark's not an apostle. He's writer of one of the accounts of the gospel, He was a co-laborer of Paul and Barnabas, but he was not an apostle. Now, according to tradition, he went to several locations, and possibly that came with Barnabas. We know that in Acts 15, when Barnabas splits off from Paul because of Mark, we know that Paul and Silas go on Paul's second and third missionary journeys, and it's thought that Barnabas and Mark went on their own missionary journey to a different location. So maybe there's some evidence of that in the Bible. It's supposed that he went to the church, or he helped found the church in Alexandria after Acts 15, around 42 AD. Now this church becomes important because it essentially is a headquarters for mission work that would extend throughout Egypt and south into further into Africa. And the thing about the church in Alexandria is that it would often be second to Rome in importance until the 4th century. After that, the church in Constantinople becomes the main challenger to the church in Rome. It's within this too that the office of bishop followed in the lineage of Mark, whereas Constantinople, it looked at Andrew, Antioch looked at Peter, Rome looked at Peter as well, and Paul as well. The church in Alexandria looked at Mark as sort of being the line in which the office of bishop followed. And then you always keep in mind the church in Jerusalem where everything began, and obviously where it began had a lot of importance. So those again are the 5 major congregations you want to know that become very important: Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, and Constantinople. So let's talk about the spread of Christianity outside the empire. We're going to look at a lot of maps on this, so it may take me a little bit of time to get all this pulled up. We're going to give it our best shot anyway. So let's talk about where Christianity spread outside the Roman Empire, first to the east. And one of the first places that it went to was a place, a region called Parthia, which was essentially what used to be the remnants of the Persian Empire, what we know today to be Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. And it was thought that Thomas was the one who was responsible for going to this area. At least that's what Eusebius records. And one of the things that we note is that conversion in this area began as early as the 1st century, because if Thomas did go to this area, obviously conversion was taking place within the 1st century. So let me pull up a map again. So Parthia, I may pull up a better one in a minute. Parthia is this region right here, the green. Wasn't officially part of the Roman Empire. They often fought with one another. But this is the area that you are looking at, where the mouse is sort of circling over. That is Parthia. So you're thinking about, again, modern day Iran, Iraq, and the very eastern, some of the eastern portions of Turkey were part of Parthia. And that is within the 1st century. All right, so go back to the PowerPoint. You can already see some of them there. All right, so another place that it went to a little bit farther to the east was Armenia and Georgia. Now, Armenia essentially was a buffer state between Rome and Parthia. Parthia wanted to annex Armenia. Rome was pretty much content with letting it be as long as it didn't fall into Parthia's hands. And so the Armenians typically favored the Romans a little bit more. But the first conversions here, at least the first evidence for conversion here, began around somewhere around the beginning of the 4th century. And so go back to that map. Right here, here's Armenia to the north of Parthia. Georgia is up in this area. It's not listed here on the map, but you're talking about, it's gone to Parthia. Beginning of the 4th century, you've got conversions up here in Armenia, and then further up north into Georgia, the modern day country of Georgia. And pull that back up. And so those are 2 places. And then the final place that we want to look to, at least for now, is to India. And India you might think that's pretty far away, but there was travel that took place between Rome and people that lived in India. India itself is connected back to either Thomas or Bartholomew. There's a really big legend about Thomas being there and essentially had a big. The tradition is that Thomas supposedly was helped out a lot of the poor in India, so much so that he was shed a lot of positive light on Christianity. Nonetheless, again, we don't know if that tradition is true or not, but there is a connection between Thomas and Christianity beginning in India. In fact, there are some churches within, at least historically, there were some churches in India that sort of hold Thomas in the same regard that Constantinople holds Andrew, or that Rome holds Peter. So it might have been that Thomas did get to India. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But we do know by the 4th century, or the 4th and 5th century, that Christianity had gotten to India. And more than likely, one of the best ways to travel was by ship from Egypt to India. And I'll pull up another map of that, a different map. So this is worldatlas.com, which you can find on Google. But the idea was, again, that you would, make sure I got the mouse right, that you take this area down through the Red Sea, come out the Gulf of Aden, and then land on the western coast of India. There were some Roman colonies that had been built in western India. So it is plausible that Christianity arrived in India pretty early on. And again, this is all happening by the 4th, 5th century. All right, so India. Let's move on and talk about to the south. And I may just leave that there for a moment and let you, instead of playing it through, because I'm swapping back between the map and the PowerPoint pretty often, I may just leave it up there like that for a moment. All right, so to the south, Christianity spreads into Ethiopia and Arabia. Obviously, we know in the book of Acts chapter 8, Philip meets the Ethiopian eunuch. There is a tradition that the Ethiopian eunuch goes back to Ethiopia, and he is the one of the people that begins the first congregation there. Certainly that might have been true. We do know that Christianity arrived in Ethiopia fairly early on. So if you're thinking about where Ethiopia is, it's a map of Africa, right? So Jerusalem up in this area, Egypt, Alexandria is right in here. So by the 4th century, you've got Christianity spreading all the way down in here, almost to Central Africa at this point. And Ethiopia, if you know its history, has strongly been connected to Christianity. And again, I'm using that in the loose sense of the term, because one of the things that you note about the rise of Islam, we'll talk about later, is that there are a lot of people in Africa that converted to Islam once it spread along the northern coast and especially into the north central region of Africa. Ethiopia was one of the few places where Islam didn't seem to get quite as much of a foothold as some other places. So that's interesting to note. At the same time, you not only have Christianity spreading into Central Africa, it's also spreading onto the Arabian Peninsula and farther south. So we think about where modern-day Saudi Arabia is, Kuwait, Qatar, those places. Christianity arrived there by the 4th and 5th centuries. And so that's where it spreads to the south. But it's also spreading to the north. And two locations to talk about in particular. One, think about the nation of Ireland, what we know to be Ireland today. Let me go back and pull up a map. So this is Europe by 300 AD, supposedly, right? So the northern extent of the Roman Empire extended all the way into the British Isles, basically where modern-day Scotland and England are divided, right? Scotland being up here. One of the expansions is that Christianity came to the island of Ireland and also into Scotland as well by the 4th and 5th century. And you probably have heard the name St. Patrick before. We know St. Patrick's Day. Well, Patrick was supposedly, I believe, a monk that spread Christianity to Ireland despite being persecuted. And so, we don't, Catholicism later on calls him a saint. We understand that, saints apply to anyone who's a Christian. But when you think about the origin of St. Patrick's Day, it goes back to Patrick, who supposedly took Christianity to Ireland. And this is happening within the first 5 centuries that Christianity has been established. So you've got Christianity spreading all the way north. But at the same time, and I'll go back to the slide for a minute, right, you've got Ireland, but you've also got the Germanic tribes to the northeast of the Roman Empire, where Christianity is also being spread. So north of Constantinople, where we know today to be what is today Eastern Europe and Germany and some of those countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, let me pull down my notes for a minute. Now, one of the things that's different about them that we'll talk about later is that these Germanic tribes often embraced Arian Christianity, which was pretty different than the Christianity that was being practiced in the Roman Empire and that would later on become Catholicism as we know it. And we'll talk about the differences later on because that becomes a big doctrinal issue that we'll note in a couple of weeks. There were some of these Germanic tribes, some of its members did join the Roman army, the Roman military, and in that way some converted to the type of Christianity that was more prevalent in the Roman Empire. And so, let me pull back a map. So we talked about Ireland, the British Isles being up here. You're talking about Christianity being spread. It's being spread up into this area where these Germanic tribes are at. In fact, when the Roman Empire falls during the 5th century, a man named Alaric, who is the leader of the Goths, who is the first person to invade Rome in several centuries, he was actually a Christian. Most people don't know that. Most people look at them as terrible people. He was actually a Christian, but he was an Arian Christian, which was different than the type of Christianity being practiced in Rome, but we'll note that more in a few weeks. But what this all is sort of an idea of how far Christianity is spreading. So if we go back and look at a map of Europe, right? When we think about where Christianity is spread, we've been primarily talking about, Italy. We talked about Carthage before. We talked about some of these areas right in here, even into Spain a little bit, right along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. We've talked about that area where Christianity is spreading. The book of Acts talks about that area. We've also talked about Greece. We've talked about Asia Minor. We've talked about Palestine as being locations where Christianity spreads in the book of Acts. But if we don't look outside the book of Acts, we don't realize that Christianity is actually spreading in a lot of different areas. So we don't think about how Christianity is even spreading further closer to India and is spreading into modern-day Iraq and Iran and up here into southern Russia. That's where Christianity is spreading in the first few centuries. Christianity is also spreading farther south into Africa. And so when you think about the growth of Christianity, it's not just happening in that area around the Mediterranean Sea, but this is happening as far as Christians can go. Sometimes we don't see that. We don't think about the growth like that, but that is reality. That's, again, the idea of going into all the world was, trying to get to the furthest reaches that man could to take the gospel. So hopefully that gives you an idea about how rapidly, how far Christianity had spread by the first few centuries. Central Africa, almost the middle of Asia, southern Russia, up into Ireland, modern day Germany, all those places, that's where Christianity has essentially gone at this time. So now let's talk about renewed persecution. And I might talk about this for about 10 to 15 minutes more and call it a close for the first part of lecture. So there are moments of persecution that are a little bit different depending on the Roman emperor. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and stop it here because we're already at 35 minutes, and this is actually a good place to stop because it's the second major point. So I will stop it here. The second part of lecture will pick up with renewed persecution, and then we will go on down to eventually maybe cover the end of this section and then talk about the rationale and rumors for persecution at the third lecture video this week. Apologize, I just ate. Well, that being said, this is the end of the first part of lecture, and I will upload the second part of lecture hopefully tomorrow morning and possibly the third part of lecture tomorrow afternoon. Well, that being said, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. If you have any questions about what we've talked about so far, feel free to email me and we can get to that, and I can get back to you on that in a little, whenever you send the email. All right, thanks.